This week on Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, I talk to political scientist and philanthropic leader James Piereson about his time at the helm of the Olin and William E. Simon Foundations. We also talk about the impact of conservative philanthropy since Reagan, the successes and missteps of conservative philanthropy during that time, what the future holds for the conservative movement, and what the ultimate influence of Trump will be. Let's go. Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, a podcast on philanthropy and civil society. I'm Jeremy Beer. Great to have you with us. Today is March 21, 2025, and I am very happy to have as our guest James Piereson, former president and trustee of the William E. Simon Foundation, among many other things, as we'll hear about, and prolific author on topics related to American politics and philanthropy. James Piereson took his bachelor and doctoral degrees from Michigan State University. He is from Michigan originally, Rockford, Michigan, just north of Grand Rapids. It may be fortunate that we're recording this now because Michigan State plays tonight in the NCAA men's basketball tournament, and that may be of some interest to Jim. He then taught at several schools, including Indiana University and the University of Pennsylvania, before going into philanthropy, as we shall see. Jim's books include Camelot and the Cultural Revolution, How the Assassination of John F. Kennedy Shattered Liberalism, The Inequality Hoax, and Shattered Consensus, The Rise and Decline of America's Post-War Political Order. Jim serves on numerous boards and committees. I won't go through all of them, but I'll note the boards of the Thomas W. Smith Foundation, the Philanthropy Roundtable, and the New Criterion. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute as well. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes here today, for the last 40 years or so, Jim led two of the most conservative foundations in the country, most important conservative foundations in the country, I should say. First, the John M. Olin Foundation from 1985 to 2005, and then the Simon Foundation, which he led until, I think it made his last grant in 2023. So with that, how are you today, Jim?
Excellent. Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it. So we'll start a little bit at the beginning. After you got your PhD at Michigan State, you launched into an academic career in political science, and you were teaching at Penn, I believe, when you got derailed into the world of philanthropy. What happened?
Well, I had embarked on a teaching career. My first job was at Iowa State. I then moved to Indiana, and then I then moved to the University of Pennsylvania. We're now talking about the mid to late 1970s. Actually, around the time of the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1976. And it's a good question why I decided to leave. I didn't like the future I saw as an academic for a couple of reasons. One, I had become somewhat disquieted with the idea of doing technical disciplinary research, which you kind of have to do to advance in academia. I was interested in broader subjects, Constitution, for example, contemporary politics. And political science was increasingly a quantitative field. We had some people interested in philosophy, some people interested in history, but a minority. So I had become a little bit discontent with the academic world. And at the University of Pennsylvania, I got very interested in the Founding Fathers because I lived very near Independence Hall. And I would stop by there often on my way over to classes. Of course, I taught the Founding Fathers in my classes. I read them, and I got more interested in those years I was at Penn. And I left Penn in 1981, 82 to go to the Olin Foundation. Someone on the faculty at Penn told me they were looking for someone who knew something about academia, and it was a conservative foundation. And would I go up and talk to them, which I did. One thing led to another, and they offered me a job. I didn't know if I really wanted to take it. I went on leave from Penn, took the job for a year. And after I spent a year there, I decided I didn't want to go back to Penn, so I stayed. Because we're now talking about early 1980s. Ronald Reagan is the president. When I went, I knew very little about charitable foundations and not a lot about the conservative movement, even though I myself was something of a conservative, was one of the reasons I left academia because of the direction it was headed. But my conservatism was a kind of founding fathers conservatism,
Mm-hmm.
kind of a traditional conservatism. And of course, as I went to the Olin Foundation, I learned there are various stripes. There are the free market conservatives, there are the national security conservatives, the National Review conservatives, there are the
Mm-hmm.
neoconservatives, there's the old right, there's the new right. So there are a lot of different stripes to it, which I learned during the years I was there. I was hired by a man by the name of Michael Joyce, who was then the executive director, and the president was William Simon. And after about 2 years there, Mike Joyce left to go to the Bradley Foundation as president of the Bradley Foundation, which at that time was a new foundation.
Right. Right.
We're now talking about 1984, 85.
Mm-hmm.
And when Mike left, I was promoted to be executive director. And he left Milwaukee. And then like a year later, I was put on the board of trustees. So it was a very interesting opportunity at that time. Ronald Reagan is president. And the conservative movement, so-called, was then in the process of expanding, partly because of Ronald Reagan, partly because of the backwash in the 1960s. You know, there are a lot of fairly distinguished scholars and thinkers who had become disappointed and unhappy with what was happening on the campus as a result of the warriors from the 1960s coming onto the campus. So
As faculty members.
You had identity politics coming in big time. You had government grants coming in big time with the federal government, exercising a lot of leverage over the college campus. Then, of course, you had all the trashing of business, the Constitution, free markets, and that sort of thing. So we developed a lot of opportunities at that time where people were starting to come to us for help. A lot of them, some of them were conservatives. A lot of them were what you call anti-left.
Yeah.
We don't like what's happening on the left side, and we're prepared to join with the conservatives. And over time, they may have changed. But I think of the neoconservatives were a little bit like that. We helped a lot of the neoconservatives. Irving Kristol was an advisor to the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
We worked closely with Bill Buckley, who was a different kind of conservative, in Russell Burt. And we worked very closely with the so-called Straussians. One of our early big grants was to Allen Bloom at the University of Chicago, who at that time was a little-known professor. But we knew of him. He was a very popular teacher. A couple years later, he wrote this international best-selling book and became very famous. We didn't know that was going to happen. But I would say that I did learn that in this world, a lot of things happen by serendipity. If you can get money to good people, they will do things that might surprise you, as Allen Bloom did.
Was that already the strategy when you got there? That, hey, we're going to fund scholars mainly here. That's going to be a primary emphasis of our grant making.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So I came up there because I knew something about academia, and I was at an Ivy League school, even though I came from Michigan State.
Right.
But I did know something about academia, and I knew a lot of where the bodies were buried, so to speak, in academia, and how to work with. But we were an East Coast foundation. Our trustees were all Ivy League graduates. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Cornell. John Olin went to Cornell. He was still alive when I went there. He died shortly thereafter. John Olin was also on the board of Johns Hopkins University and had given a lot of money to universities
Mhm.
in that period, 50s and 60s. There are a lot of libraries around the country named after John Olin.
Mm.
He paid for them.
How did he
But
make his money? Where did John come from?
Olin Industries, the company made its money originally by selling black powder to the United States government in World War One.
Oh, wow.
Then it owned Remington and Winchester rifles. It made fertilizers. It was a large conglomerate.
Mm.
You don't hear about much anymore. They made skis.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mm.
so, and John Olin was a trustee at Cornell when the troubles started in Cornell in 1969. Some radical students took over the student union, brandishing machine guns. You may have heard about that. And John Olin decided at some point in the 70s that he would like to use his money to bolster the free enterprise system in America and fight against the radicals that he saw taking over the college.
Mhm.
And that was the origin of the foundation.
Okay.
That why Mike Joyce went there, and that was one of the reasons I wound up there. So yes, in the sense we were an East Coast foundation, so we were oriented a lot to the elite university.
Mhm.
So we did a fair amount at the Eastern universities and the think tanks on the East Coast. When we ventured outside the Northeast, it was often at University of Chicago or Stanford or some such place.
Was there anybody else doing anything like this at the time? Um, Certainly on the right, but were you mimicking something you'd seen on the left, or just kind of inventing this as you went
Well,
along?
I'd say two things. One, the Ford Foundation had been very active on the left,
Mhm.
seeding money for advocacy groups and college programs on gender and race. Many of the advocacy groups that were active in that period, some of them still active, were seeded by the Ford Foundation.
Mm.
They also created these litigation groups. So they were, this is under McGeorge Bundy, who came to Ford in the mid 1960s.
Mhm.
So they were kind of off and running on this strategy. So there was a thought that we did something on our side to counteract this, maybe even to mimic on our side some of the things they did. So we did fund litigation groups, public interest groups,
Mhm.
as they did. We did try to fund academic programs. We did fund books, think tanks, uh, and that sort of thing. So there was that. Um, in terms of conservative funders, there were some, but not exactly like us. SCAFE was
Mhm.
very active at
Okay.
the time. They had a strong national security focus and a free market focus.
Mhm.
We had a little bit different focus in the sense we were oriented a lot to these universities, but there was some overlap. And then the Bradley Foundation came along and they overlapped to some degree also, but they also had a state and local focus, Milwaukee and Wisconsin.
Mhm.
So we were a little bit different in the sense that we didn't have any of those things. And we were in New York City and we could kind of get lost in New York. And, we saw a lot of people in New York. So we set off to build a program. John Olin wanted the foundation to sunset. He said
Right.
roughly 25 years after my death. But in any case, during the working lifetime of his trustees.
Mm.
He died in 1982, and we closed in 2005. So we came pretty close.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were able to spend a lot of money because when I got there, it was right at the time when the bull market started in 1982.
Yep.
So John Olin left initially $60 or $70 million to the foundation when he died. And for the first couple of years before I took over, we were only spending $2, $3, $4 million a year. I came in and looked at the assets, and they were in excess of $100 million. And I said, we can spend a fair amount of money here,
Yeah.
especially if we're thinking of closing eventually.
Mhm.
So um, I said, we can easily go from $3 or $4 million a year to 10 or $15 million a year.
It's a big jump.
Yes. Yeah, the good part of it was nobody knew it.
Yeah.
In other
Right.
words, I could pick and choose where
Yeah.
we spend it. If you announced it to the world, you'd be inundated with proposals.
Yeah. What were
So,
some of the first big ideas you had on how to spend that?
yeah, Federalist Society was in there pretty early.
Hmm.
The Collegiate Network was in there pretty early. Um, Alan Bloom at Chicago was in there pretty early. A law and
Yeah.
economics programs we
Yep.
did at various universities were in there pretty early. Um, we, uh, I remember making some large grants to the public interest, Irving Kristol's magazine.
Hmm.
Uh, we were pretty generous with the Heritage Foundation. So we went from, I don't know, that 3 or 4 million in 1984 to probably 15 million by 1988, 89.
Yeah.
John Olin left another $100 or so million to his widow.
Mm.
Uh, and when she died in 1993, that money came into the foundation.
Wow.
So we began to spend that as well. So at about the time we had spent down John Olin's corpus, we had that fund
Hmm.
coming in.
Yeah. Wow.
So, we were pretty active. I would say that when we started, the conservative movement was pretty small. In retrospect, I see that I didn't realize it at the time because I didn't know that much about it. There are some giant people around. There's Bill Buckley and
Hmm.
Bill Friedman and Irving Kristol, and a few others who are around. But the ranks are pretty thin. We didn't have much on the college campus. And, we didn't have much that would be a presence in the intellectual debates around the country.
Hmm.
And I would say that one of the things we did and other donors helped in that 20, 25 years was that we kind of helped to build up the conservative movement to a fairly large enterprise, which was the case by the time we closed in 2005. Many think tanks, many college programs,
Yeah.
not all of them supported by us.
Right.
Autonomous things, other donors came in. The
Hmm.
stock market created a lot of donors to our causes, a lot of donors to other causes too.
Yeah.
And so that was a period where the conservative movement grew and expanded quite substantially through the donations of a few foundations. Now, the left always had way more money than we had.
Yeah.
I think I calculated once that if you threw in the 7 or 8 or 10 liberal foundations and the 3 or 4 or 5 conservative foundations, they outspent us every year 20 or 30 to 1.
Yeah.
So we didn't have a lot of money, but I
That's
think,
not counting the university resources as well.
yeah, and I mean, they had a lot going for them. Plus, they had the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks. This is before cable TV and before the internet.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I got up every day and I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And I read regularly commentary in the New Republic and National Review and a handful of other magazines. That's how I informed myself. And that's where the debates took place, kind of on those pages. It's all different now,
Right.
but that was how it was then. And
Yeah.
that was the kind of the world we dealt with. So I think we spent probably close to $400 million in that 25 years, almost all of it on conservative causes. We didn't waste
Hmm.
a lot of it on other things.
Hmm.
A lot of foundations get diverted because the trustees are interested in this or that other charity, but there's very little of that with the Olin Foundation. I had a splendid board of trustees. Bill Simon was there. Uh, Bill Simon was a hard guy to get along with.
Talk about Bill Simon for people who don't know who he was and what
Yeah,
he
Bill
was like.
Simon was a legendary bond salesman in New York City in the 50s and 60s. And he had a great interest in politics. He was very much involved in buying and selling treasury securities in that period. I think he got to know George Shultz, who was Nixon's Treasury Secretary at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And Schultz recruited him to go into the Nixon administration in 1971, and he was the second energy czar. So in a period when there were gas lines and oil embargoes, Simon became the energy czar. And there was a lot of rationing of gasoline. You could only buy certain amounts on. And the prices were very high.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Simon, with the advice of some economists, said, let's let the market go and let the market settle this. And the prices will settle and the supplies will settle, because what was happening is that people were driving around with 3/4 of their tanks filled. And every time they saw a gas station, they'd pull in to fill it up because they didn't know if they'd get any more.
Right.
So if you could kind of get rid of that problem, you would stabilize it. And he did. In the middle of Watergate, George Shultz said, I want to get out of here. I want to retire and go back to Chicago or eventually to the Hoover Institution. And Simon replaced him as Treasury Secretary in 1974. And he became popular because he went around the country talking about free markets and how horrible Washington was and how terrible the Congress was and how they're wasting taxpayers' money and so on. And he wrote a best-selling book when he came out called The Time for Truth.
Right.
But he was a notoriously difficult man, highly impatient. He was doing 100 different things at once.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't like to waste his time.
Right.
If you didn't get straight to the point, he'd hang up the phone on you or tell her, kick you out of his office. And so, you had to learn to be pretty precise and get right to the point and get to the facts so he could make a decision on it. But generally he backed us up once he trusted us. And, we all learned to get along with him, all the staff and so on. There are plenty of laughs along those lines about because he was very eccentric in that way. But he did protect us from the outside world. In other words, you had a man of his stature, Treasury Secretary, best-selling author, sitting on top of the organization. People are going to think twice before they mess with it.
Yeah.
They know he can come at them pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that was a benefit to all of us.
Oh, that's great.
At the time. And he did that. Whenever there's a controversy, he ran out and defended us, and he held up the side. And he usually gave more than he got. And, people took a lesson from that, you ought to think twice before you tangle with this group. And that was a good thing for us. Yeah. Simon died in the year 2000 at the age of 73. So we'd been active for a long time. And when he died, we decided that we'd spend the foundation out in 5 years by 2005, which is what we did. And, in the latter years, we kind of spent the money on our favorite programs. Law and Economics was one, some of our think tanks, Heritage was one, Manhattan Institute was one. So kind of, at the end, as we assessed what we did, we could see that we played a large role in building up the conservative movement, helping to create a lot of institutions, young people who came along into the movement.
And some real phenomena, like you pointed out, in terms of books and ideas and intellectuals. I'd love to hear more about Alan Bloom and Closing of the American Mind, sort of how that came about. But also, I think Francis Fukuyama and the End of History was something that you all were involved with somehow, and Samuel Huntington as well, and his work on the Clash of Civilizations. I mean, those would be three of the biggest books to hit in the last quarter or so of the 20th century.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. So, they wrote these books after we didn't fund the books. They kind of outstanding authors and thinkers, and they wrote the books later. So on Alan Bloom, we're aware of the Straussians, and Bloom was a legendary teacher at Chicago, and many people studied with him. And I don't know, one thing led to another. Mike Joyce knew some people at Chicago, and Alan Bloom came to us with this project. And the idea was to run seminars where students would read these great books. And then you would bring in policymakers and talk to them to find out, you know, what did you learn from the books and what can we learn from the policymakers and so
Mm-hmm.
on. And he had some terrific people in that program at Chicago, Edwin Shills,
Mm-hmm.
Leszek Kolakowski. There was
Yeah.
a whole list of outstanding people who participated in that program. Some of Bloom's students did go on to become policymakers, like Paul Wolfowitz.
Mm-hmm.
One, I think
Yeah.
Wolfowitz came back and worked in the seminar. So Bloom then wrote a long essay for National Review in the late 80s on what's the problem with universities. And the problem with the university, simply put, was that liberalism had become so pervasive that nobody could think outside of the boundaries of the left-wing liberals anymore. It was a kind of a closing of the American mind.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Buckley once said, liberals are always eager to hear other ideas until they actually hear one. Yeah. And then they're not so interested in it.
Right.
So, so Bloom turned that article into this book called The Closing of the American Mind.
Yeah.
And one of our friends, Roger Kimball, gave a good review of it in the New York Times. And it became a bestseller.
Yeah.
Bloom became famous and he became rich.
Mm-hmm.
And he went around the country lecturing, and he was a fantastic talker. There's no question about it.
What was he like in person? What was Alan Bloom like in person?
Well, he had he had 10 ideas every second.
Okay.
I mean, he could hardly keep up with the ideas in his head.
Okay.
And, they would come spilling out of him. And it was just a fascinating guy.
Interesting.
I can see why the students kind of came and listened to him.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was a performance. And, he was friends with the novelist at Chicago, Saul Bellow.
Paul Bellow. Yeah.
And Bellow wrote a novel several years later called Ravelstein. And it was based on Alan Bloom and, his best-selling book and that sort of thing. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So, but he had a great influence at Chicago. And there are many students who read that book who wanted to go study with Bloom.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to a lot of them, and I wasn't eager to encourage them down that path because I was aware how difficult it was to make your way as an academic.
Right.
I mean, if you wanted to do that for the love of ideas, fine.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't recommend it as a career. So,
Right.
I think some of these young guys did go off and become lawyers and that sort of thing. So and Bloom died in 1992. So like 4 years, 5 years after this book was done.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Fukuyama, it's a different thing. We started a magazine called The National Interest.
Mm-hmm.
Irving Kristol had the public interest. So this is going to be a magazine about foreign affairs. Based on, let's look at foreign affairs through the lens of American national interest. A little bit like Trump is doing now, not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so a man named Owen Harries was recruited to be the editor. And he had been at the Heritage Foundation. He was Australian. And he'd written some stuff about, how bad the United Nations was in regard to America.
Mm-hmm.
So he edited that magazine, and he would go around to conferences. And there was one conference at the University of Chicago that Bloom was putting on.
Mm-hmm.
He encountered this paper called what was it called? The End of History?
The End of History, I believe. Yeah.
By Fukuyama.
Mm-hmm.
And he took the paper, edited it, put it on the cover of the magazine. And it was, one of these sensations.
Yeah.
And it turned into a book. Now, Fukuyama said everything he had to say in the article. He didn't have much more to say in the book.
Okay.
But it was a best-selling book. So,
yeah.
Again, that was not anything we did. We created the magazine and so on.
But you funded the platform, that made that possible.
And then Sam Huntington Because I had been in political science, I knew who Sam Huntington was. He was a well-known national security analyst at Harvard. He had been president of the American Political Science Association. I was aware of that too. So I went up to see him at one point in the late 80s, and we agreed we'd set up this thing called the John M. Olin Center for National Security Studies. And we funded it.
Mm-hmm.
And Huntington had a bunch of fellows who went on to teach, many of them, late in their careers now. Here we are 35 years later. And he'd bring them into Harvard to speak. I went up there a lot to listen to them. And then he wrote this book called The Clash of Civilization, which I believe may have originated as an article in Foreign Affairs. And then he turned it into a book, and it was a big discussion.
Right.
So that's true. All these things were done. We weren't in any way responsible for them, but you're right. We helped to pay for the platforms that somewhat allowed them to be written.
Sure.
But that was somewhat the point of the whole thing.
Right.
We couldn't orchestrate everything, but we could provide the funds to create the platform.
Right.
And honestly, I didn't know enough to do all this sort of thing. I couldn't have written any of those books and couldn't suggested them or anything like that. But, I suppose we did know enough to send the money to people who could do something with it. And a lot of them did.
It was a real investment in ideas and in intellectuals, thinkers. Do you think, even as big as it is now in many ways, do you think the sort of center-right sort of funders invest enough in ideas and thinkers, intellectuals today? Or should they be doing more of that kind of work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Our general thinking was that the American people were roughly on our side, but they didn't have people articulating the ideas in influential places. They weren't with the Ford Foundation, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They were more with us. But they needed to have some people articulating the ideas in places of influence.
Yep.
And communicating them to policymakers so they would have, the ideas and the framework to start telling the voters about it. But if you don't have that, you're kind of lost. And I think in the 1960s and 70s, we didn't really have that. And we did help to build it up. Now, I think you could ask the question, do ideas play a similar role in our lives today as they did in the 1980s and 90s, before the internet age, where we all read the papers, we're all reading magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Our ideas really did matter. If they were good ideas, you can get them into the discourse. They matter as much today when everything changes day by day.
Yeah.
And things seem a little bit more ephemeral. Are people really buying and reading books anymore? Especially books of ideas.
Yeah, but who you influence, right? So someone like J.D. Vance, it clearly would have gone in a totally different direction had he not encountered certain ideas and books out of the conservative political tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition,
Mm-hmm.
and now is in a position of extraordinary influence, right? So there's still that argument.
Yeah, that's true, and he is a thinker.
Yeah.
I don't think Donald Trump is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I realize there are different types here that we're talking about.
Yeah. So, of course, he had a best-selling book about his background.
Yeah.
I just don't know if and of course, we're kind of shut out of the universities. So
yeah. Something. Did you think Olin could actually keep that from happening? Are you surprised at how refractory universities have been?
Wait a minute, we tried and we couldn't stop it.
Yeah.
So, if you ask me today, could you start an Allen Bloom Center or a Sam Huntington Center or any of those things today? Well, I think it would be difficult.
Yeah.
I'm not as close to it now as I used to be, but I'm not sure you have the people in place to do that.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the university, we did a lot of stuff to try to stop it, but the race and gender stuff was too powerful. We're aware of it. We fought against it. And they just kept building up strength. And so now to some extent, they're paying the price for that. You look at Columbia.
Yeah.
That is, the colleges have built up these way left-wing faculties. And they're to some degree stuck with them. So at Columbia, the president tries to enforce the rules and arrest all these people, which last year they did. But the left-wing faculty revolts and says, we don't want you to do that. You've got to let them all go. And we're going to fire the president.
Right.
That's the faculty they have. Columbia would be a much stronger institution if 20 or 25% of the faculty were moderates or conservative, but they're not.
Right.
And that's because they drove the wall out. I mean, if you look at, some of the curricula they have at Columbia, they're generally insane. The women's studies program is just absolutely clinically insane.
Yeah.
If you look at the courses they teach. And, if they had moderate or conservative people, it might not have happened. But in any case, they're stuck with the system they built. They're out of favor in Washington. Washington is coming down hard on them, pulling out their funds and so on. It is interesting in the sense that they built up the diversity industry using federal muscle. If you don't hire our people, our diversity people, we'll pull our money out of the university. Now, they were pushing against an open door because they're happy to do that.
Right.
Donald Trump is now coming along and saying, wait a second, all this diversity stuff violates the Civil Rights Act. And if you keep doing it, we're going to pull out our federal money. And now you're whipsawed. And so they do have a crisis. But back to your large question, do ideas matter that much anymore? Than they used to?
Yeah.
I generally think not.
Okay.
I don't have a firm view on that. I haven't thought it through. I think, there's so much out there. There are so many people who write now because of the internet.
Yeah.
And every day it changes. There's a new set of writers out there. And there are no gatekeepers anymore in that way.
So if you wanted to invest in something today, if Olin were still around and you're trying to make the smart investments, what would you invest in? If not ideas, would you invest in particular platforms or more popular thinkers or podcasts or Substacks? Or
actually, I'm still in the business because I'm advising the Thomas Smith Fund.
True enough. Yeah.
And we're not large. Maybe we spend $10 million a year. We do try to spend a lot of it on people who write stuff which we think is influential. Heather McDonald's a fellow, for example. John Yoo at Berkeley, some support. Steve Moore writes stuff on the free market, someone we support. George Mason University and some of their programs. We support Christopher Rufo.
Right.
We support.
There's a good example of someone who's sort of operating at the intersection of ideas and media.
That is an interesting phenomenon, the Chris Rufo phenomenon.
Yeah.
In other words, someone who is both familiar with the thinking. He wrote a pretty good book, actually, a couple of years ago, on The Roots of Wokeism, I think it was called. A good book. But he's an activist as well. He's advising Trump on how to close the education department, how to get rid of DEI. So he's both an activist and a thinker. And, we haven't had really people like that quite so much. So that's the kind of thing that I would like to kind of see more of.
That's interesting.
And he's a young guy. So, he's not, I think our old guys interested in ideas, they're debating ideas with people. He's got these ideas and he wants to take them straight to government. Now, it is interesting because Trump is also a different kind of figure than the Republican presidents we've had.
Say the least, yes.
So that, if you wanted to close the education department with George H.W. Bush, I don't think you could get in the door.
Right.
We can't close the education department. Or if you wanted to kill affirmative action and diversity, you couldn't get in the door because there would be people telling Bush, no, this is a good thing. We got to keep it
Hmm.
and so on. So Trump, when he hears something he likes, he's ready to go out and run with it.
Right.
And that's new. We've never had a president like that.
Hmm.
So I think, I'm not sure if it was Rufo or maybe it was Larry Ard at Hillsdale, who, when Trump was president the first time, they came out, the New York Times came out with the 1619 Project. And Larry Ard or somebody came out with the 1776 Project to counter it.
Right.
Well, Trump saw it on Fox News and said, I'm going to create a commission.
Hmm.
Larry Ard running it.
Right.
George Bush would have never done that. No, Fox News didn't exist at the time either. So it's a different kind of circumstance. Did I ever think that we could get rid of DEI? I never thought we could get rid of it.
Hmm.
Trump comes along, and I think he's going to get rid of it
Hmm.
because, one, he's put the weight of the government behind this, and it always thrived because government was behind it.
Hmm.
Democrats mostly. Well, we're going to take your money away if you don't do it. So, and also, they can't wait him out. He's going to be there for 4 more years.
Yeah.
And the first time around, they kept him so much on the defensive, he wasn't able to do anything. And in past years, they would say whenever they made Bush or Reagan or whatever made feints against them, Gingrich, they would finesse it and say, they'll be gone before too long and we can go on as before. But I don't think Trump's going to let him get away with that. So I think he may wind up really killing DEI and turning it into a very unfavorable idea. And because of the federal funding, all these schools are going to have to go along with it.
In the school, speaking of schools, that is something, just to pivot quickly here at the end of our conversation to the William E. Simon Foundation. K through 12 education is one of the areas I believe you guys invested in heavily at the Simon Foundation.
A lot of scholarships, school vouchers, charter schools. That was a big area for us.
Yeah. What was most promising about, what did you find most promising in terms of the grant making you did there on the education side?
Well, I mean, I think we got into that movement at Olin to some degree in the 1990s because it was just picking up. But it wasn't a big factor. At Simon, it was a much larger factor. But we were focused mostly on New York.
Mm-hmm.
And we did do some national thinking about charter schools and school choice, supporting those programs. But if you want to reform the educational system, public school is a pretty hard thing to attack because they're run by the unions.
Right.
And it's pretty hard. Pretty hard to penetrate them. You kind of have to try to do it and run around them. So that led to charter schools and vouchers. We did do some curricular stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the standards, we did support some of the standards, but that didn't work very well in the public schools because, one, they can always find ways to take the curriculum because they're too into teaching. They can manipulate the curriculum.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because a lot of state legislatures have told colleges they have to teach courses in American government.
Correct. Yeah.
But what good does it do if you have a left winger teaching the course?
Yeah. Personnel is policy, right?
So,
I mean,
we kind of had that problem. So charter schools been a pretty big success, I would say, in New York City. They tried to cap them and close them down, but there are a number of good networks. Success Academy is a terrific network in New York City. The KIPP academies have been very good. Programs like this are bubbling up all over the country, partly by parental demand. And a lot of parents are disappointed with the kind of teaching and curriculum that it got worse in the last 5 years. Now you have these other issues that are coming in, like transgenderism. A lot of parents look at that kind of thing and say, we don't want our son or daughter coming home and wanting to change genders and that sort of thing.
Right.
and maybe we ought to reconsider the schools. So I think those have been a large factor. So, school choice, looking around the country, a lot of states are signing on to school choice in one way or another,
Mm-hmm.
an option for parents because the public schools have gotten so bad in many areas. Probably not true so much of some of the suburban schools where the parents are
Mm-hmm.
active and where
Right.
the parents move there for the schools. But look, the unions are pervasive in many states. And so it's not clear to me why, and I'd have to have somebody explain to me why the unions want to water down the standards and why they want to introduce all of these novel concepts into education. Not clear to me why they're wedded to those things. I
Mm-hmm.
get the union collective bargaining,
Right. Right.
got that,
Yeah.
but why all these newfangled ideas that don't necessarily work,
Mm-hmm.
which turn off parents? Why have they done that? Is that due to the alliance with the education schools? I
Mm-hmm.
I've never had a good answer to why
Yeah.
they have to do that.
It's a good
Now, you
question.
can say, well, why does the Democratic Party have to do it? I
Yeah.
mean, that makes even less sense for them because they want to cobble together a majority of voters, but
Right.
nonetheless, they do it too.
Yeah.
And my answer to the latter is because of the influence of their groups.
Mm-hmm.
Their groups seem to be able to punish people who stray off the reservation.
Sure.
And, voters only go to the polls every 2 or 4 years. The groups
Right.
are there every day.
That's right.
And, the same is a little bit true of professors at the colleges. If they wander off the reservation and say some critical things about the groups, the diversity groups, the gender groups, the race groups, they will be denouncing them in the student newspaper the next day, or they'll be
Mm-hmm.
marching around their office the next day.
Right.
And of course, nobody wants that.
Pretty big disincentive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a large consequence of the politicization of the schools and higher education.
I'll wrap this up here. I'll ask you one last question, I guess. What would you say are the biggest, two-part question, biggest mistakes conservative funders or philanthropists have made in the post-Cold War era, and the biggest successes? If you have one in each category, maybe. Whatever you want to say.
I don't know if I could answer that. I mean, I can, think of a fair number of successes that Olin and others were involved in. I'm trying to think of some missteps that we made. And there were missteps. I don't know they were strategic missteps.
Mm-hmm.
We were funding a lot of student newspapers,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the our students would write things they shouldn't have written. We weren't responsible for it necessarily, but then we got tagged with it. So we had to find a way out of that.
Yeah.
Which eventually we did. Because, we didn't want to be responsible for everything a student newspaper wrote.
Right.
And, I'd have to think on that question, we made grants that didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
But, those were more individuals.
Yeah, of course. Everybody makes grants that don't work.
I don't know if it's a problem with the conservative foundations. A lot of business people invested too much in business schools, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting answer. Yeah.
And we did a little bit about that.
Mm.
And, one of the problems there is the business schools are kind of under the general influence of the university. And, they go along with a lot of things the university did. So there's some of that. I don't know if that was a mistake.
That's a learning, at least.
Yeah. But it's a good question. What mistakes were made? Now, I mean, if you go back to the early part of the conservative movement, some people like Bill Buckley would say that getting behind Senator McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, was a problem.
Hmm. Sure.
That, there's nothing wrong with anti-communism, but the tactics that you use there turn people off and defeat the purpose.
Yeah.
Was there
That's a
something
good
like
example.
that we got involved in? I
Mhm.
think, I think that in handling the race and gender and diversity issues, it required some delicacy
Right.
uh, and a degree of, sophistication as to how to handle those. You can't, right? It wasn't, if you make the analogy to McCarthy, you just couldn't come out there and denounce the idea
Yeah.
because, you could look bad. And it was not easy to oppose.
Hmm.
So, we did have some people who got out there on that and got on the wrong side of it and
Hmm.
were, somewhat embarrassed by some of the things they wrote and said.
Yeah.
I don't want to mention any names there,
Yeah.
but
Sure.
so, as that movement went on, one of the things, it kind of became more and more aggressive until more recently when they adopted the DEI business, it became extremely radical.
Yeah. It became much easier to target,
Yeah,
actually.
right.
Yeah.
Now, so, and because they went so far off to the left, it made it easier for us to attack. Um, but before that, and that when they were just saying we want to expand opportunity, now they were doing more than that. They did have an agenda, and it was a left wing agenda, but they did cover it by saying we just want to expand opportunity for groups that haven't had opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure we necessarily, and we got into trouble a little bit, somewhat, on those
Hmm.
issues. And, it required some conversations about how to handle it. Uh, the biggest successes I would say that we had was we just built the platforms for the conservative movement. We built the think tanks, the college programs, the magazines, got those ideas out there into the world. You got the Federalist Society, you got the student newspapers. You have that whole infrastructure of the conservative movement that is just now very mature. I mean, the Federalist Society is very interesting. I remember when they came to our office in 1982, and these were kids, students, law school
Yeah.
students, not kids.
Hmm. Right.
And they had just put on a conference, I think at Yale. They were Chicago, Yale, and Harvard law students. And we want to create this society, Federalist Society. And I thought, okay, it'll be a campus movement of law school students at these three schools, maybe some more. And they said, we want to create a national office and we want to hire somebody. Our response is, why do you want to create a national office? You're a student group.
Hmm.
Oh, they had so we gave them some money to do it. And they hired Gene Meyer and they created a national office. And they were off and running. And they did things over a period of time and they became more influential as time passed. It probably took them 20 years to develop a full head of steam.
Mm.
The
It's a
Federalists,
lesson there too. Yeah.
they finally really come into their own when they start picking Trump's judges.
Yeah.
All Federalist Society judges who go on the
Yeah.
federal bench of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Now, did we anticipate that? We started 40 years ago. No.
Yeah.
The one thing we did know is this: we don't have anything in the judicial area. The liberals own the whole Constitution.
Hmm.
We don't have anything there. We got to start something. This is as
Right.
good as anything else. So
Yeah.
let's see what we can do.
Yeah.
And that was our attitude with a lot of things. You give them some money
Hmm.
and see what they can do. If they can do it, give more money. If they
Yeah.
can't, put the money elsewhere.
Pretty
But let's
simple strategy. Yeah.
and I didn't pick and choose among the various groups, the neoconservatives, the free market people. I
Hmm.
didn't know enough.
Hmm.
Uh, and that was a good thing.
Yeah.
One of our virtues was, we were aware we didn't know everything. So don't pick and choose, get the money out to people who can do something with it and then watch it
Right.
and kind of let it go. That's kind of what we did. It was successful, I think,
Yeah.
but we didn't really know what we were doing as we were doing it.
Right.
Maybe it's a little bit like a business that starts out with small and builds on itself and eventually has something worthwhile.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
So, we had a great staff, all friends, 6, 7 small staff,
Hmm.
private people. I look at some of these philanthropies with 100 people on the staff.
Yeah.
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
With a lot of turnover. And so we had a staff that was pretty stable over 25 years at Olin.
Hmm.
Same thing in Simon, pretty much same.
Yeah.
in Simon.
Yeah.
And that helped. So, it's an interesting history. John Miller has written a book about the Olin Foundation.
Which I should point out is right behind me here.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent.
Yeah.
It's right there.
Called A
And
Gift of Freedom for people who want to look it up by John J. Miller.
that's right. It's on Amazon,
Yeah.
and he's written some shorter pamphlets, and there have been newspaper articles about all the things we did. And, occasionally in situations like this, I get to kind of look back and talk about it. But 20 years ago, the Olin Foundation closed,
Yeah.
2005. So I'm quite a bit older, and that's kind of receded in the history.
But it's a very important piece, though, of American philanthropic history, I think. And that's why I wanted to have you on this podcast to discuss it, because it's played a huge role in things like Federalist Society and in very important books like Alan Bloom's, and in creating a counter structure of funding for America's sort of center-right thinkers and activists.
I think we did show how it could be done.
Yeah.
I would say this. We haven't had a lot of people to try to emulate us.
Yeah. Which is surprising to me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now I'm kind of doing that with the Thomas W. Smith Foundation.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
and we do have Bradley out there doing
Mhm.
good things, and the Scape out there. But
Mm.
the Bradley Foundation people came around to talk to us in 1985 because they knew about us.
Hmm.
They're just starting the Bradley Foundation. What are you doing, and how are you doing it? And they met us and so on. And they kind of started out in somewhat the same way. I'd be hard pressed to name any other group that tried to do anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
why? Well, I have a few thoughts about that, which is that when people want to give their money away, they want to give it away in a manner that will make people pat them on the back. You're doing good work.
hmm
You're a good person, etc. Conservative ideas, people either like you or they really dislike you. Controversial.
Yeah.
That's what we had at Olin. We had a lot of people who liked us. On the other side, we had a lot of people who really disliked us. And New York Times wrote any number of negative and hostile articles about us over the years. And, when people want to give their money away, do they really want to get into that? They want to see their name blasted over the front page of the New York Times saying you're doing this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
And when we had controversies and we're on the cover of the New York Times, it did cause trouble because we have trustees. The trustees have families.
Yeah.
They have children in school. They have neighbors. They belong to clubs.
I'll say clubs. Yeah.
Yeah. And when this stuff starts popping up, it can make them uncomfortable.
Right.
And that doesn't happen if you're giving your funds away to maybe the local school or the local charities or the Red Cross, good things like that.
Yeah.
Will be applauded.
Yeah.
So I would say that is a factor.
Definitely.
In the whole thing.
I think you're right.
Yeah. It didn't bother John Olin because he'd been through it and he was older. It didn't bother the Bradley people either, but a lot of people it bothers. But, but the Bradley thing has been controversial in Milwaukee. It's not been an easy road for them either.
Yeah. Because of teachers' unions, among other things.
Teachers' unions and, other people. So why don't you spend all this money locally, they would say.
Yeah.
that's been a tough thing too for them to handle, and they've done it very well. So,
Yeah.
that would be one answer. Maybe the
Well,
main answer.
yeah.
People don't go into the charitable world to be attacked.
Well, let's consider this an invitation for someone to do that. Set up the next 20, 25 years of something like the Olin
I
Foundation.
think Tom Smith wants to do it.
Okay.
And he's doing it.
Yep.
And we have other friends. I didn't mention the Searle Freedom Trust.
Yeah. Also spending down.
Yes. And, they've been active in this world as well. Dan Searle did this 25 years or so ago.
Yeah.
So, there is some of it. But there were definitely not as much as I thought there might be, 5 years ago.
Well, James Piereson, thanks so much for spending some time with us, talking about this history and sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Actually, Jeremy, good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. And as I said before, one more time, if you want to read a little bit about this history, A Gift of Freedom by John J. Miller is very much worth getting. So thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe and or rate and or review us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Thanks a lot.